Chapter 41 of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
March 20th. Having now got rid of Mr. Huntingdon for a season, my spirits begin to revive. He left me early in February, and the moment he was gone, I breathed again, and felt my vital energy return, not with the hope of escape, he has taken care to leave me no visible chance of that, but with the determination to make the best of existing circumstances. Here was Arthur left to me at last, and rousing from my despondent apathy, I exerted all my powers to eradicate the weeds that had been fostered in his infant mind, and sow again the good seed they had rendered unproductive. Thank heaven, it is not a barren or a stony soil. If weeds spring fast there, so do better plants. His apprehensions are more quick, his heart more overflowing with affection than ever his father's could have been, and it is no hopeless task to bend him to obedience, and win him to love, and know his own true friend, as long as there is no one to counteract my efforts. I had much trouble at first in breaking him of those evil habits his father had taught him to acquire, but already that difficulty is nearly vanquished now. Bad language seldom defiles his mouth, and I have succeeded in giving him an absolute disgust for all intoxicating liquors, which I hope not even his father or his father's friends will be able to overcome. He was inordinately fond of them for so young a creature, and remembering my unfortunate father as well as his, I dreaded the consequences of such a taste. But if I had stinted him in his usual quantity of wine, or forbidden him to taste it altogether, that would only have increased his partiality for it, and made him regard it as a greater treat than ever. I therefore gave him quite as much as his father was accustomed to allow him, as much, indeed, as he desired to have, but into every glass I surreptitiously introduced a small quantity of tartar emetic, just enough to produce inevitable nausea and depression without positive sickness. Finding such disagreeable consequences invariably to result from this indulgence, he soon grew weary of it, but the more he shrank from the daily treat, the more I pressed it upon him, till his reluctance was strengthened to perfect abhorrence. When he was thoroughly disgusted with every kind of wine, I allowed him, at his own request, to try brandy and water, and then gin and water, for the little toper was familiar with them all, and I was determined that all should be equally hateful to him. This I have now effected, and since he declares that the taste, the smell, the sight of any one of them is sufficient to make him sick, I have given up teasing him about them, except now and then as objects of terror in cases of misbehaviour. Arthur, if you're not a good boy, I shall give you a glass of wine. Or, now, Arthur, if you say that again, you shall have some brandy and water, is as good as any other threat, and once or twice, when he was sick, I have obliged the poor child to swallow a little wine and water, without the tartar emetic, by way of medicine, and this practice I intend to continue for some time to come, not that I think it of any real service in a physical sense, but because I am determined to enlist all the powers of association in my service. I wish this aversion to be so deeply grounded in his nature that nothing in after life may be able to overcome it. Thus, I flatter myself, I shall secure him from this one vice, and for the rest, if on his father's return I find reason to apprehend that my good lessons will be all destroyed, if Mr. Huntingdon commence again the game of teaching the child to hate and despise his mother, and emulate his father's wickedness, I will yet deliver my son from his hands. I have devised another scheme that might be resorted to in such a case, and if I could but obtain my brother's consent and assistance, I should not doubt of its success. The old hall where he and I were born, and where our mother died, is not now inhabited, nor yet quite sunk into decay, as I believe. Now, if I could persuade him to have one or two rooms made habitable, and to let them to me as a stranger, I might live there, with my child, under an assumed name, and still support myself by my favourite art. He should lend me the money to begin with, and I would pay him back, and live in lowly independence and strict seclusion, for the house stands in a lonely place, and the neighbourhood is thinly inhabited, and he himself should negotiate the sale of my pictures for me. I have arranged the whole plan in my head, and all I want is to persuade Frederick to be of the same mind as myself. He is coming to see me soon, and then I will make the proposal to him, having first enlightened him upon my circumstances sufficiently to excuse the project. Already, I believe, he knows much more of my situation than I have told him. I can tell this by the air of tender sadness pervading his letters, and by the fact of his so seldom mentioning my husband, and generally evincing a kind of covert bitterness when he does refer to him, as well as by the circumstance of his never coming to see me when Mr. Huntingdon is at home. But he has never openly expressed any disapprobation of him, or sympathy for me. He has never asked any questions, or said anything to invite my confidence. Had he done so, I should probably have had but few concealments from him. Perhaps he feels hurt at my reserve. He is a strange being. I wish we knew each other better. He used to spend a month at Stanningley every year, before I was married, but since our father's death I have only seen him once, when he came for a few days while Mr. Huntingdon was away. He shall stay many days this time, and there shall be more candour and cordiality between us than ever there was before, since our early childhood. My heart clings to him more than ever, and my soul is sick of solitude. April 16th. He is come and gone. He would not stay above a fortnight. The time passed quickly, but very, very happily, and it has done me good. I must have a bad disposition, for my misfortunes have soured and embittered me exceedingly. I was beginning insensibly to cherish very unamiable feelings against my fellow mortals, the male part of them especially. But it is a comfort to see there is at least one among them worthy to be trusted and esteemed, and doubtless there are more, though I have never known them, unless I except poor Lord Loughborough, and he was bad enough in his day. But what would Frederick have been, if he had lived in the world, and mingled from his childhood with such men as these of my acquaintance? And what will Arthur be, with all his natural sweetness of disposition, if I do not save him from that world and those companions? I mentioned my fears to Frederick, and introduced the subject of my plan of rescue on the evening after his arrival, when I presented my little son to his uncle. He is like you, Frederick, said I, in some of his moods. I sometimes think he resembles you more than his father, and I am glad of it.
You flatter me, Helen,
replied he, stroking the child's soft wavy locks. No, you will think it no compliment when I tell you I would rather have him to resemble Benson than his father. He slightly elevated his eyebrows, but said nothing. Do you know what sort of man Mr. Huntingdon is? Said I.
I think I have an idea.
Have you so clear an idea that you can hear, without surprise or disapproval, that I meditate escaping with that child to some secret asylum, where we can live in peace, and never see him again?
Is it really so?
If you have not, continued I, I'll tell you something more about him. And I gave a sketch of his general conduct, and a more particular account of his behaviour with regard to his child, and explained my apprehensions on the latter's account, and my determination to deliver him from his father's influence. Frederick was exceedingly indignant against Mr. Huntingdon, and very much grieved for me. But still he looked upon my project as wild and impracticable. He deemed my fears for Arthur disproportioned to the circumstances, and opposed so many objections to my plan, and devised so many milder methods for ameliorating my condition, that I was obliged to enter into further details to convince him that my husband was utterly incorrigible, and that nothing could persuade him to give up his son, whatever became of me, he being as fully determined the child should not leave him, as I was not to leave the child; and that, in fact, nothing would answer but this, unless I fled the country, as I had intended before. To obviate that, he at length consented to have one wing of the old hall put into a habitable condition, as a place of refuge against a time of need, but hoped I would not take advantage of it, unless circumstances should render it really necessary, which I was ready enough to promise. For though, for my own sake, such a hermitage appears like paradise itself, compared with my present situation, yet for my friends' sakes, for Millicent and Esther, my sisters in heart and affection, for the poor tenants of Grassdale, and above all, for my aunt, I will stay if I possibly can. July 29th. Mrs. Hargrave and her daughter are come back from London. Esther is full of her first season in town, but she is still heart-whole and unengaged. Her mother sought out an excellent match for her, and even brought the gentleman to lay his heart and fortune at her feet. But Esther had the audacity to refuse the noble gifts. He was a man of good family and large possessions, but the naughty girl maintained he was old as Adam, ugly as sin, and hateful as one who shall be nameless.
But indeed I had a hard time of it,
said she.
Mamma was very greatly disappointed at the failure of her darling project, and very, very angry at my obstinate resistance to her will, and is so still, but I can't help it, and Walter, too, is so seriously displeased at my perversity and absurd caprice, as he calls it, that I fear he will never forgive me. I did not think he could be so unkind as he has lately shown himself, but Millicent begged me not to yield, and I am sure, Mrs. Huntingdon, if you had seen the man they wanted to palm upon me, you would have advised me not to take him too.
I should have done so whether I had seen him or not, said I. It is enough that you dislike him.
I knew you would say so, though mamma affirmed you would be quite shocked at my undutiful conduct. You can't imagine how she lectures me. I am disobedient and ungrateful. I am thwarting her wishes, wronging my brother, and making myself a burden on her hands. I sometimes fear she'll overcome me after all. I have a strong will, but so has she, and when she says such bitter things it provokes me to such a pass that I feel inclined to do as she bids me, and then break my heart and say, "There, mamma, it's all your fault."
"Pray don't," said I. "Obedience from such a motive would be positive wickedness, and certain to bring the punishment it deserves. Stand firm, and your mamma will soon relinquish her persecution, and the gentleman himself will cease to pester you with his addresses if he finds them steadily rejected."
Oh, no, mamma will weary all about her before she tires herself with her exertions, and as for Mr. Oldfield, she has given him to understand that I have refused his offer, not from any dislike of his person, but merely because I am giddy and young, and cannot at present reconcile myself to the thoughts of marriage under any circumstances. But by next season, she has no doubt, I shall have more sense, and hopes my girlish fancies will be worn away. So she has brought me home to school me into a proper sense of my duty, against the time comes around again. Indeed, I believe she will not put herself to the expense of taking me up to London again unless I surrender. She cannot afford to take me to town for pleasure and nonsense, she says, and it is not every rich gentleman that will consent to take me without a fortune, whatever exalted ideas I may have of my own attractions.
Well, Esther, I pity you, but still I repeat, stand firm. You might as well sell yourself to slavery at once as marry a man you dislike. If your mother and brother are unkind to you, you may leave them. But remember, you are bound to your husband for life.
But I cannot leave them unless I get married, and I cannot get married if nobody sees me. I saw one or two gentlemen in London that I might have liked, but they were younger sons, and mamma would not let me get to know them. One especially, who I believe rather liked me, but she threw every possible obstacle in the way of our better acquaintance. Wasn't it provoking?
I have no doubt you would feel it so. But it is possible that if you married him, you might have more reason to regret it hereafter than if you married Mr. Oldfield. When I tell you not to marry without love, I do not advise you to marry for love alone. There are many, many other things to be considered. Keep both heart and hand in your own possession, till you see good reason to part with them. And if such an occasion should never present itself, comfort your mind with this reflection, that though in single life your joys may not be very many, your sorrows, at least, will not be more than you can bear. Marriage may change your circumstances for the better, but, in my private opinion, it is far more likely to produce a contrary result.
So thinks Millicent, but allow me to say that I think otherwise. If I thought myself doomed to old maidenhood, I should cease to value my life. The thoughts of living on year after year at the Grove, a hanger-on upon mamma and Walter, a mere cumberer of the ground, now that I know in what light they would regard it, is perfectly intolerable. I would rather run away with the butler.
Your circumstances are peculiar, I allow. But have patience, love. Do nothing rashly. Remember, you are not yet 19, and many years are yet to pass before anyone can set you down as an old maid. You cannot tell what Providence may have in store for you. And meantime, remember you have a right to the protection and support of your mother and brother, however they may seem to grudge it.
You are so grave, Mrs. Huntington,
said Esther, after a pause.
When Millicent uttered the same discouraging sentiments concerning marriage, I asked if she was happy. She said she was, but I only half believed her, and now I must put the same question to you.
It is a very impertinent question, laughed I, from a young girl to a married woman so many years her senior, and I shall not answer it.
Pardon me, dear madam,
said she, laughingly throwing herself into my arms, and kissing me with playful affection. But I felt a tear on my neck, as she dropped her head on my bosom, and continued, with an odd mixture of sadness and levity, timidity and audacity.
I know you are not so happy as I mean to be, for you spend half your life alone at Grassdale, while Mr. Huntington goes about enjoying himself where and how he pleases. I shall expect my husband to have no pleasures but what he shares with me, and if his greatest pleasure of all is not the enjoyment of my company, why, it will be the worse for him, that's all.
If such are your expectations of matrimony, Esther, you must indeed be careful whom you marry, or rather, you must avoid it altogether.
End of chapter 41. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
September 1st. No Mr. Huntingdon yet. Perhaps he will stay among his friends till Christmas, and then, next spring, he will be off again. If he continue this plan, I shall be able to stay at Grassdale well enough. That is, I shall be able to stay, and that is enough. Even an occasional bevy of friends at the shooting season may be borne, if Arthur gets so firmly attached to me, so well established in good sense and principles, before they come, that I shall be able, by reason and affection, to keep him pure from their contaminations. Vain hope, I fear, but still, till such a time of trial comes, I will forbear to think of my quiet asylum in the beloved old hall. Mr. and Mrs. Hattersley have been staying at the Grove a fortnight, and as Mr. Hargrave is still absent, and the weather was remarkably fine, I never passed a day without seeing my two friends, Millicent and Esther, either there or here. On one occasion, when Mr. Hattersley had driven them over to Grassdale in the phaeton, with little Helen and Ralph, and we were all enjoying ourselves in the garden, I had a few minutes' conversation with that gentleman, while the ladies were amusing themselves with the children.
"Do you want to hear anything of your husband, Mrs. Huntingdon?"
said he. "No, unless you can tell me when to expect him home."
"I can't. You don't want him, do you?"
said he, with a broad grin. "No."
"Well, I think you're better without him, sure enough. For my part, I'm downright weary of him. I told him I'd leave him if he didn't mend his manners, and he wouldn't, so I left him. You see, I'm a better man than you think me. And what's more, I have serious thoughts of washing my hands of him entirely, and the whole set of 'em, and comporting myself from this day forward with all decency and sobriety, as a Christian and the father of a family should do. What do you think of that?"
"It is a resolution you ought to have formed long ago."
"Well, I'm not 30 yet. It isn't too late, is it?"
"No, it is never too late to reform, as long as you have the sense to desire it, and the strength to execute your purpose."
"Well, to tell you the truth, I've thought of it often and often before. But he's such devilish good company, is Huntingdon, after all. You can't imagine what a jovial good fellow he is when he's not fairly drunk, only just primed, or half seas over. We all have a bit of a liking for him at the bottom of our hearts, though we can't respect him."
"But should you wish yourself to be like him?"
"No, I'd rather be like myself, bad as I am."
"You can't continue as bad as you are, without getting worse and more brutalized every day, and therefore more like him." I could not help smiling at the comical, half-angry, half-confounded look he put on at this rather unusual mode of address. "Never mind my plain speaking," said I. "It is from the best of motives. But tell me, should you wish your sons to be like Mr. Huntingdon, or even like yourself?"
"Hang it, no!"
"Should you wish your daughter to despise you, or, at least, to feel no vestige of respect for you, and no affection but what is mingled with the bitterest regret?"
"Oh, no, I couldn't stand that."
"And finally, should you wish your wife to be ready to sink into the earth when she hears you mentioned, and to loathe the very sound of your voice, and shudder at your approach?"
"She never will. She likes me all the same, whatever I do."
"Impossible, Mr. Hattersley. You mistake her quiet submission for affection."
"Fire and fury!"
"Now don't burst into a tempest at that. I don't mean to say she does not love you. She does, I know, a great deal better than you deserve. But I'm quite sure that if you behave better, she will love you more, and if you behave worse, she will love you less and less, till all is lost in fear, aversion, and bitterness of soul, if not in secret hatred and contempt. But, dropping the subject of affection, should you wish to be the tyrant of her life, to take away all the sunshine from her existence, and make her thoroughly miserable?"
"Of course not, and I don't, and I'm not going to."
"You have done more towards it than you suppose."
"Pooh-pooh! She's not the susceptible, anxious, worrying creature you imagine. She's a little meek, peaceable, affectionate body, apt to be rather sulky at times, but quiet and cool in the main, and ready to take things as they come."
"Think of what she was 5 years ago, when you married her, and what she is now."
"I know she was a little plump lassie then, with a pretty pink and white face. Now she's a poor little bit of a creature, fading and melting away like a snow wreath. But hang it, that's not my fault."
"What is the cause of it, then? Not years, for she's only 25."
"It's her own delicate health, and confound it, madam! What would you make of me? And the children, to be sure, that worry her to death between them."
"No, Mr. Hattersley, the children give her more pleasure than pain. They are fine, well-dispositioned children."
"I know they are. Bless them."
"Then why lay the blame on them? I'll tell you what it is. It's silent fretting and constant anxiety on your account, mingled, I suspect, with something of bodily fear on her own. When you behave well, she can only rejoice with trembling. She has no security, no confidence in your judgment or principles, but is continually dreading the close of such short-lived felicity. When you behave ill, her causes of terror and misery are more than any one can tell but herself. In patient endurance of evil, she forgets it is our duty to admonish our neighbours of their transgressions. Since you will mistake her silence for indifference, come with me, and I'll show you one or two of her letters. No breach of confidence, I hope, since you are her other half. He followed me into the library. I sought out and put into his hands 2 of Millicent's letters, one dated from London, and written during one of his wildest seasons of reckless dissipation, the other in the country, during a lucid interval. The former was full of trouble and anguish, not accusing him, but deeply regretting his connection with his profligate companions, abusing Mr. Grimsby and others, insinuating bitter things against Mr. Huntingdon, and most ingeniously throwing the blame of her husband's misconduct onto other men's shoulders. The latter was full of hope and joy, yet with a trembling consciousness that this happiness would not last, praising his goodness to the skies, but with an evident, though but half-expressed wish, that it were based on a surer foundation than the natural impulses of the heart, and a half-prophetic dread of the fall of that house so founded on the sand, which fall had shortly after taken place, as Hattersley must have been conscious while he read. Almost at the commencement of the first letter, I had the unexpected pleasure of seeing him blush, but he immediately turned his back to me, and finished the perusal at the window. At the second, I saw him, once or twice, raise his hand, and hurriedly pass it across his face. Could it be to dash away a tear? When he had done, there was an interval spent in clearing his throat and staring out of the window, and then, after whistling a few bars of a favourite air, he turned round, gave me back the letters, and silently shook me by the hand.
"I've been a cursed rascal, God knows,"
said he, as he gave it a hearty squeeze.
"but you see if I don't make amends for it. Damn me if I don't."
Don't curse yourself, Mr. Hattersley. If God had heard half your invocations of that kind, you would have been in hell long before now, and you cannot make amends for the past by doing your duty for the future, inasmuch as your duty is only what you owe to your Maker, and you cannot do more than fulfil it. Another must make amends for your past delinquencies. If you intend to reform, invoke God's blessing, his mercy, and his aid, not his curse.
God help me, then, for I'm sure I need it. Where's Millicent?
She's there, just coming in with her sister. He stepped out at the glass door, and went to meet them. I followed at a little distance. Somewhat to his wife's astonishment, he lifted her off from the ground, and saluted her with a hearty kiss and a strong embrace. Then placing his 2 hands on her shoulders, he gave her, I suppose, a sketch of the great things he meant to do, for she suddenly threw her arms round him, and burst into tears, exclaiming,
"Do, do, Ralph. We shall be so happy. How very, very good you are."
"Nay, not I,"
said he, turning her round, and pushing her towards me.
"Thank her, it's her doing."
Millicent flew to thank me, overflowing with gratitude. I disclaimed all title to it, telling her her husband was predisposed to amendment before I added my mite of exhortation and encouragement, and that I had only done what she might, and ought to have done, herself.
"Oh, no,"
cried she.
"I couldn't have influenced him, I'm sure, by anything that I could have said. I should only have bothered him by my clumsy efforts at persuasion, if I had made the attempt."
"You never tried me, Milly,"
said he. Shortly after they took their leave. They are now gone on a visit to Hattersley's father. After that they will repair to their country home. I hope his good resolutions will not fall through, and poor Millicent will not be again disappointed. Her last letter was full of present bliss, and pleasing anticipations for the future, but no particular temptation has yet occurred to put his virtue to the test. Henceforth, however, she will doubtless be somewhat less timid and reserved, and he more kind and thoughtful. Surely, then, her hopes are not unfounded, and I have one bright spot at least whereon to rest my thoughts.
End of chapter 42. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
October 10th. Mr. Huntingdon returned about 3 weeks ago. His appearance, his demeanour and conversation, and my feelings with regard to him, I shall not trouble myself to describe. The day after his arrival, however, he surprised me by the announcement of an intention to procure a governess for little Arthur. I told him it was quite unnecessary, not to say ridiculous, at the present season. I thought I was fully competent to the task of teaching him myself, for some years to come at least. The child's education was the only pleasure and business of my life, and since he had deprived me of every other occupation, he might surely leave me that. He said I was not fit to teach children, or to be with them. I had already reduced the boy to little better than an automaton. I had broken his fine spirit with my rigid severity, and I should freeze all the sunshine out of his heart, and make him as gloomy and ascetic as myself, if I had the handling of him much longer. And poor Rachel, too, came in for her share of abuse, as usual. He cannot endure Rachel, because he knows she has a proper appreciation of him. I calmly defended our several qualifications as nurse and governess, and still resisted the proposed addition to our family, but he cut me short by saying it was no use bothering about the matter, for he had engaged a governess already, and she was coming next week, so that all I had to do was to get things ready for her reception. This was a rather startling piece of intelligence. I ventured to inquire her name and address, by whom she had been recommended, or how he had been led to make choice of her.
"She is a very estimable, pious young person,"
said he.
"You needn't be afraid. Her name is Myers, I believe, and she was recommended to me by a respectable old dowager, a lady of high repute in the religious world. I have not seen her myself, and therefore cannot give you a particular account of her person and conversation, and so forth. But if the old lady's eulogies are correct, you will find her to possess all desirable qualifications for her position, an inordinate love of children among the rest."
All this was gravely and quietly spoken, but there was a laughing demon in his half-averted eye that boded no good, I imagined. However, I thought of my asylum in shire, and made no further objections. When Miss Myers arrived, I was not prepared to give her a very cordial reception. Her appearance was not particularly calculated to produce a favourable impression at first sight, nor did her manners and subsequent conduct, in any degree, remove the prejudice I had already conceived against her. Her attainments were limited, her intellect no ways above mediocrity. She had a fine voice, and could sing like a nightingale, and accompany herself sufficiently well on the piano, but these were her only accomplishments. There was a look of guile and subtlety in her face, a sound of it in her voice. She seemed afraid of me, and would start if I suddenly approached her. In her behaviour she was respectful and complacent, even to servility. She attempted to flatter and fawn upon me at first, but I soon checked that. Her fondness for her little pupil was overstrained, and I was obliged to remonstrate with her on the subject of overindulgence and injudicious praise, but she could not gain his heart. Her piety consisted in an occasional heaving of sighs, and uplifting of eyes to the ceiling, and the utterance of a few cant phrases. She told me she was a clergyman's daughter, and had been left an orphan from her childhood, but had had the good fortune to obtain a situation in a very pious family. And then she spoke so gratefully of the kindness she had experienced from its different members, that I reproached myself for my uncharitable thoughts and unfriendly conduct, and relented for a time, but not for long. My causes of dislike were too rational, my suspicions too well founded for that, and I knew it was my duty to watch and scrutinize till those suspicions were either satisfactorily removed or confirmed. I asked the name and residence of the kind and pious family. She mentioned a common name, and an unknown and distant place of abode, but told me they were now on the continent, and their present address was unknown to her. I never saw her speak much to Mr. Huntingdon, but he would frequently look into the schoolroom to see how little Arthur got on with his new companion, when I was not there. In the evening she sat with us in the drawing-room, and would sing and play to amuse him, or us, as she pretended, and was very attentive to his wants, and watchful to anticipate them, though she only talked to me. Indeed, he was seldom in a condition to be talked to. Had she been other than she was, I should have felt her presence a great relief to come between us thus, except, indeed, that I should have been thoroughly ashamed for any decent person to see him as he often was. I did not mention my suspicions to Rachel, but she, having sojourned for half a century in this land of sin and sorrow, has learned to be suspicious herself. She told me from the first she was
down of that new governess,
and I soon found she watched her quite as narrowly as I did, and I was glad of it, for I longed to know the truth. The atmosphere of Grassdale seemed to stifle me, and I could only live by thinking of Wildfell Hall. At last, one morning, she entered my chamber with such intelligence that my resolution was taken before she had ceased to speak. While she dressed me, I explained to her my intentions, and what assistance I should require from her, and told her which of my things she was to pack up, and what she was to leave behind for herself, as I had no other means of recompensing her for this sudden dismissal after her long and faithful service, a circumstance I most deeply regretted, but could not avoid. "And what will you do, Rachel?" said I. "Will you go home, or seek another place?"
I have no home, ma'am, but with you,
she replied.
and if I leave you, I'll never go into place again as long as I live.
"But I can't afford to live like a lady now," returned I. "I must be my own maid, and my child's nurse."
What signifies?
replied she, in some excitement.
You'll want somebody to clean and wash and cook, won't you? I can do all that, and never mind the wages. I've my bits of savings yet, and if you wouldn't take me, I should have to find my own board and lodging out of 'em somewhere, or else work among strangers, and it's what I'm not used to. So you can please yourself, ma'am."
Her voice quavered as she spoke, and the tears stood in her eyes. "I should like it above all things, Rachel, and I'd give you such wages as I could afford, such as I should give to any servant of all work I might employ. But don't you see I should be dragging you down with me, when you have done nothing to deserve it?"
"Oh, fiddle!"
ejaculated she. "And besides, my future way of living will be so widely different to the past, so different to all you have been accustomed to."
"You think, ma'am, I can't bear what my missus can? Surely I'm not so proud and so dainty as that comes to. And my little master, too, God bless him."
"But I'm young, Rachel. I shan't mind it. And Arthur is young too. It will be nothing to him."
"Nor me either. I'm not so old but what I can stand hard fare and hard work, if it's only to help and comfort them as I've loved like my own bairns, for all I'm too old to bide the thoughts of leaving 'em in trouble and danger, and going among strangers myself."
"Then you shan't, Rachel," cried I, embracing my faithful friend. "We'll all go together, and you shall see how the new life suits you."
"Bless you, honey,"
cried she, affectionately returning my embrace.
"only let us get shut of this wicked house, and we'll do right enough, you'll see."
"So think I," was my answer, and so that point was settled. By that morning's post I dispatched a few hasty lines to Frederick, beseeching him to prepare my asylum for my immediate reception, for I should probably come to claim it within a day after the receipt of that note, and telling him, in few words, the cause of my sudden resolution. I then wrote 3 letters of adieu, the first to Esther Hargrave, in which I told her that I found it impossible to stay any longer at Grassdale, or to leave my son under his father's protection, and, as it was of the last importance that our future abode should be unknown to him and his acquaintance, I should disclose it to no one but my brother, through the medium of whom I hoped still to correspond with my friends. I then gave her his address, exhorted her to write frequently, reiterated some of my former admonitions regarding her own concerns, and bade her a fond farewell. The second was to Millicent, much to the same effect, but a little more confidential, as befitted our longer intimacy, and her greater experience and better acquaintance with my circumstances. The third was to my aunt, a much more difficult and painful undertaking, and therefore I had left it to the last, but I must give her some explanation of that extraordinary step I had taken, and that quickly, for she and my uncle would no doubt hear of it within a day or two after my disappearance, as it was probable that Mr. Huntington would speedily apply to them to know what was become of me. At last, however, I told her I was sensible of my error. I did not complain of its punishment, and I was sorry to trouble my friends with its consequences, but in duty to my son I must submit no longer. It was absolutely necessary that he should be delivered from his father's corrupting influence. I should not disclose my place of refuge even to her, in order that she and my uncle might be able, with truth, to deny all knowledge concerning it, but any communications addressed to me, under cover to my brother, would be certain to reach me. I hoped she and my uncle would pardon the step I had taken, for if they knew all, I was sure they would not blame me, and I trusted they would not afflict themselves on my account, for if I could only reach my retreat in safety, and keep it unmolested, I should be very happy, but for the thoughts of them, and should be quite contented to spend my life in obscurity, devoting myself to the training up of my child, and teaching him to avoid the errors of both his parents. These things were done yesterday. I have given 2 whole days to the preparation for our departure, that Frederick may have more time to prepare the rooms, and Rachel to pack up the things, for the latter task must be done with the utmost caution and secrecy, and there is no one but me to assist her. I can help to get the articles together, but I do not understand the art of stowing them into the boxes, so as to take up the smallest possible space, and there are her own things to do, as well as mine and Arthur's. I can ill afford to leave anything behind, since I have no money, except a few guineas in my purse, and besides, as Rachel observed, whatever I left would most likely become the property of Miss Myers, and I should not relish that. But what trouble I have had throughout these 2 days, struggling to appear calm and collected, to meet him and her as usual, when I was obliged to meet them, and forcing myself to leave my little Arthur in her hands for hours together. But I trust these trials are over now. I have laid him in my bed for better security, and never more, I trust, shall his innocent lips be defiled by their contaminating kisses, or his young ears polluted by their words. But shall we escape in safety? Oh, that the morning were come, and we were on our way at least! This evening, when I had given Rachel all the assistance I could, and had nothing left me but to wait, and wish, and tremble, I became so greatly agitated that I knew not what to do. I went down to dinner, but I could not force myself to eat. Mr. Huntingdon remarked the circumstance.
"What's to do with you now?"
said he, when the removal of the second course gave him time to look about him. "I am not well," I replied. "I think I must lie down a little. You won't miss me much?"
"Not the least. If you leave your chair it'll do just as well. Better, a trifle,"
he muttered, as I left the room.
"For I can fancy somebody else fills it."
Somebody else may fill it to-morrow, I thought, but did not say. "There, I've seen the last of you, I hope," I muttered, as I closed the door upon him. Rachel urged me to seek repose at once, to recruit my strength for to-morrow's journey, as we must be gone before the dawn. But in my present state of nervous excitement, that was entirely out of the question. It was equally out of the question to sit, or wander about my room, counting the hours and the minutes between me and the appointed time of action, straining my ears, and trembling at every sound, lest someone should discover and betray us after all. I took up a book and tried to read. My eyes wandered over the pages, but it was impossible to bind my thoughts to their contents. Why not have recourse to the old expedient, and add this last event to my chronicle? I opened its pages once more, and wrote the above account, with difficulty at first, but gradually my mind became more calm and steady. Thus several hours have passed away. The time is drawing near, and now my eyes feel heavy and my frame exhausted. I will commend my cause to God, and then lie down and gain an hour or two of sleep. And then! Little Arthur sleeps soundly. All the house is still. There can be no one watching. The boxes were all corded by Benson, and quietly conveyed down the back stairs after dusk, and sent away in a cart to the M coach office. The name upon the cards was Mrs. Graham, which appellation I mean henceforth to adopt. My mother's maiden name was Graham, and therefore I fancy I have some claim to it, and prefer it to any other, except my own, which I dare not resume.
End of chapter 43. Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
October 24th. Thank heaven I am free and safe at last. Early we rose, swiftly and quietly dressed, slowly and stealthily descended to the hall, where Benson stood ready with a light, to open the door, and fasten it after us. We were obliged to let one man into our secret, on account of the boxes, etc. All the servants were but too well acquainted with their master's conduct, and either Benson or John would have been willing to serve me, but as the former was more staid and elderly, and a crony of Rachel's besides, I of course directed her to make choice of him as her assistant and confidant on the occasion, as far as necessity demanded. I only hope he may not be brought into trouble thereby, and only wish I could reward him for the perilous service he was so ready to undertake. I slipped 2 guineas into his hand, by way of remembrance, as he stood in the doorway, holding the candle to light our departure, with a tear in his honest grey eye, and a host of good wishes depicted on his solemn countenance. Alas! I could offer no more. I had barely sufficient remaining for the probable expenses of the journey. What trembling joy it was when the little wicket closed behind us, as we issued from the park! Then, for one moment, I paused, to inhale one draught of that cool, bracing air, and venture one look back upon the house. All was dark and still. No light glimmered in the windows, No wreath of smoke obscured the stars that sparkled above it in the frosty sky. As I bade farewell forever to that place, the scene of so much guilt and misery, I felt glad that I had not left it before, for now there was no doubt about the propriety of such a step. No shadow of remorse for him I left behind. There was nothing to disturb my joy but the fear of detection, and every step removed us further from the chance of that. We had left Grassdale many miles behind us before the round red sun arose to welcome our deliverance, and if any inhabitant of its vicinity had chanced to see us then, as we bowled along on the top of the coach, I scarcely think they would have suspected our identity. As I intend to be taken for a widow, I thought it advisable to enter my new abode in mourning. I was therefore attired in a plain black silk dress and mantle, a black veil, which I kept carefully over my face for the first 20 or 30 miles of the journey, and a black silk bonnet, which I had been constrained to borrow of Rachel, for want of such an article myself. It was not in the newest fashion, of course, but none the worse for that, under present circumstances. Arthur was clad in his plainest clothes, and wrapped in a coarse woollen shawl, and Rachel was muffled in a grey cloak and hood that had seen better days, and gave her more the appearance of an ordinary though decent old woman than of a lady's maid. Oh, what delight it was to be thus seated aloft, rumbling along the broad sunshiny road, with the fresh morning breeze in my face, surrounded by an unknown country, all smiling, cheerfully, gloriously smiling in the yellow lustre of those early beams, with my darling child in my arms, almost as happy as myself, and my faithful friend beside me, a prison and despair behind me, receding further, further back at every clatter of the horses' feet, and liberty and hope before. I could hardly refrain from praising God aloud for my deliverance, or astonishing my fellow passengers by some surprising outburst of hilarity. But the journey was a very long one, and we were all weary enough before the close of it. It was far into the night when we reached the town of L, and still we were 7 miles from our journey's end, and there was no more coaching, nor any conveyance to be had, except a common cart, and that with the greatest difficulty, for half the town was in bed. And a dreary ride we had of it, that last stage of the journey, cold and weary as we were, sitting on our boxes, with nothing to cling to, nothing to lean against, slowly dragged and cruelly shaken over the rough, hilly roads. But Arthur was asleep in Rachel's lap, and between us we managed pretty well to shield him from the cold night air. At last we began to ascend a terribly steep and stony lane, which, in spite of the darkness, Rachel said she remembered well. She had often walked there with me in her arms, and little thought to come again so many years after, under such circumstances as the present. Arthur being now awakened by the jolting and the stoppages, we all got out and walked. We had not far to go. But what if Frederick should not have received my letter? Or if he should not have had time to prepare the rooms for our reception, and we should find them all dark, damp, and comfortless, destitute of food, fire, and furniture, after all our toil? At length the grim dark pile appeared before us. The lane conducted us round by the back way. We entered the desolate court, and in breathless anxiety surveyed the ruinous mass. Was it all blackness and desolation? No, one faint red glimmer cheered us from a window where the lattice was in good repair. The door was fastened, but after due knocking and waiting, and some parleying with a voice from an upper window, we were admitted by an old woman who had been commissioned to air and keep the house till our arrival, into a tolerably snug little apartment, formerly the scullery of the mansion, which Frederick had now fitted up as a kitchen. Here she procured us a light, roused the fire to a cheerful blaze, and soon prepared a simple repast for our refreshment, while we disencumbered ourselves of our travelling gear, and took a hasty survey of our new abode. Besides the kitchen, there were 2 bedrooms, a good-sized parlour, and another smaller one, which I destined for my studio, all well aired and seemingly in good repair, but only partly furnished with a few old articles, chiefly of ponderous black oak, the veritable ones that had been there before, and which had been kept as antiquarian relics in my brother's present residence, and now, in all haste, transported back again. The old woman brought my supper and Arthur's into the parlour, and told me, with all due formality, that
the master desired his compliments to Mrs. Graham, and he had prepared the rooms as well as he could upon so short a notice, but he would do himself the pleasure of calling upon her to-morrow, to receive her further commands.
I was glad to ascend the stern-looking stone staircase, and lie down in the gloomy old-fashioned bed, beside my little Arthur. He was asleep in a minute, but weary as I was, my excited feelings and restless cogitations kept me awake till dawn began to struggle with the darkness, but sleep was sweet and refreshing when it came, and the waking was delightful beyond expression. It was little Arthur that roused me, with his gentle kisses. He was here, then, safely clasped in my arms, and many leagues away from his unworthy father. Broad daylight illumined the apartment, for the sun was high in heaven, though obscured by rolling masses of autumnal vapour. The scene, indeed, was not remarkably cheerful in itself, either within or without. The large bare room, with its grim old furniture, the narrow latticed windows, revealing the dull grey sky above, and the desolate wilderness below, with the dark stone walls and iron gate, the rank growth of grass and weeds, and the hardy evergreens, of preternatural forms, alone remained to tell that there had been once a garden. And the bleak and barren fields beyond might have struck me as gloomy enough at another time. But now, each separate object seemed to echo back my own exhilarating sense of hope and freedom. Indefinite dreams of the far past, and bright anticipations of the future, seemed to greet me at every turn. I should rejoice with more security, to be sure, had the broad sea rolled between my present and my former homes. But surely in this lonely spot I might remain unknown. And then I had my brother here to cheer my solitude with his occasional visits. He came that morning, and I have had several interviews with him since, but he is obliged to be very cautious when and how he comes. Not even his servants or his best friends must know of his visits to Wildfell, except on such occasions as a landlord might be expected to call upon a stranger tenant, lest suspicion should be excited against me, whether of the truth or of some slanderous falsehood. I have now been here nearly a fortnight, and, but for one disturbing care, the haunting dread of discovery, I am comfortably settled in my new home. Frederick has supplied me with all requisite furniture and painting materials. Rachel has sold most of my clothes for me, in a distant town, and procured me a wardrobe more suitable to my present position. I have a second-hand piano, and a tolerably well-stocked bookcase in my parlour, and my other room has assumed quite a professional, business-like appearance already. I am working hard to repay my brother for all his expenses on my account. Not that there is the slightest necessity for anything of the kind, but it pleases me to do so. I shall have so much more pleasure in my labour, my earnings, my frugal fare, and household economy, when I know that I am paying my way honestly, and that what little I possess is legitimately all my own, and that no one suffers for my folly, in a pecuniary way at least. I shall make him take the last penny I owe him, if I can possibly effect it without offending him too deeply. I have a few pictures already done, for I told Rachel to pack up all I had, and she executed her commission but too well, for among the rest she put up a portrait of Mr. Huntingdon that I had painted in the first year of my marriage. It struck me with dismay at the moment, when I took it from the box, and beheld those eyes fixed upon me, and their mocking mirth, as if exulting still in his power to control my fate, and deriding my efforts to escape. How widely different had been my feelings in painting that portrait to what they now were in looking upon it! How I had studied and toiled to produce something, as I thought, worthy of the original! What mingled pleasure and dissatisfaction I had had in the result of my labours! Pleasure for the likeness I had caught, dissatisfaction because I had not made it handsome enough. Now I see no beauty in it, nothing pleasing in any part of its expression. And yet it is far handsomer and far more agreeable, far less repulsive, I should rather say, than he is now, for these 6 years have wrought almost as great a change upon himself as on my feelings regarding him. The frame, however, is handsome enough. It will serve for another painting. The picture itself I have not destroyed, as I had first intended. I have put it aside, not, I think, from any lurking tenderness for the memory of past affection, nor yet to remind me of my former folly, but chiefly that I may compare my son's features and countenance with this, as he grows up, and thus be enabled to judge how much or how little he resembles his father, if I may be allowed to keep him with me still, and never to behold that father's face again, a blessing I hardly dare reckon upon. It seems Mr. Huntingdon is making every exertion to discover the place of my retreat. He has been in person to Stanningley, seeking redress for his grievances, expecting to hear of his victims, if not to find them there, and has told so many lies, and with such unblushing coolness, that my uncle more than half believes him, and strongly advocates my going back to him, and being friends again. But my aunt knows better. She is too cool and cautious, and too well acquainted with both my husband's character and my own, to be imposed upon by any specious falsehoods the former could invent. But he does not want me back. He wants my child, and gives my friends to understand that if I prefer living apart from him, He will indulge the whim, and let me do so unmolested, and even settle a reasonable allowance on me, provided I will immediately deliver up his son. But heaven help me! I am not going to sell my child for gold. Though it were to save both him and me from starving, it would be better that he should die with me than that he should live with his father. Frederick showed me a letter he had received from that gentleman, full of cool impudence, such as would astonish anyone who did not know him, but such as, I am convinced, none would know better how to answer than my brother. He gave me no account of his reply, except to tell me that he had not acknowledged his acquaintance with my place of refuge, but rather left it to be inferred that it was quite unknown to him, by saying it was useless to apply to him, or any other of my relations, for information on the subject, as it appeared I had been driven to such extremity that I had concealed my retreat even from my best friends; but that if he had known it, or should at any time be made aware of it, most certainly Mr. Huntington would be the last person to whom he should communicate the intelligence, and that he need not trouble himself to bargain for the child, for he, Frederick, fancied he knew enough of his sister to enable him to declare that wherever she might be, or however situated, no consideration would induce her to deliver him up. 30th. Alas! my kind neighbours will not let me alone. By some means they have ferreted me out, and I have had to sustain visits from 3 different families, all more or less bent upon discovering who and what I am, whence I came, and why I have chosen such a home as this. Their society is unnecessary to me, to say the least, and their curiosity annoys and alarms me. If I gratify it, it may lead to the ruin of my son, and if I am too mysterious, it will only excite their suspicions, invite conjecture, and rouse them to greater exertions, and perhaps be the means of spreading my fame from parish to parish till it reach the ears of some one who will carry it to the Lord of Grassdale Manor. I shall be expected to return their calls, but if, upon inquiry, I find that any of them live too far away for Arthur to accompany me, they must expect in vain for a while, for I cannot bear to leave him, unless it be to go to church, and I have not attempted that yet; for, it may be foolish weakness, but I am under such constant dread of his being snatched away, that I am never easy when he is not by my side, and I fear these nervous terrors would so entirely disturb my devotions, that I should obtain no benefit from the attendance. I mean, however, to make the experiment next Sunday, and oblige myself to leave him in charge of Rachel for a few hours. It will be a hard task, but surely no imprudence, and the vicar has been to scold me for my neglect of the ordinances of religion. I had no sufficient excuse to offer, and I promised, if all were well, he should see me in my pew next Sunday, for I do not wish to be set down as an infidel, and besides, I know I should derive great comfort and benefit from an occasional attendance at public worship. If I could only have faith and fortitude to compose my thoughts in conformity with the solemn occasion, and forbid them to be for ever dwelling on my absent child, and on the dreadful possibility of finding him gone when I return. And surely God in his mercy will preserve me from so severe a trial. For my child's own sake, if not for mine, he will not suffer him to be torn away. November 3rd. I have made some further acquaintance with my neighbours. The fine gentleman and beau of the parish and its vicinity, in his own estimation at least, is a young—
Here it ended. The rest was torn away. How cruel, just when she was going to mention me, for I could not doubt it was your humble servant she was about to mention, though not very favourably, of course. I could tell that, as well by those few words as by the recollection of her whole aspect and demeanour towards me in the commencement of our acquaintance. Well, I could readily forgive her prejudice against me, and her hard thoughts of our sex in general, when I saw to what brilliant specimens her experience had been limited. Respecting me, however, she had long since seen her error, and perhaps fallen into another in the opposite extreme. For if at first her opinion of me had been lower than I deserved, I was convinced that now my deserts were lower than her opinion, and if the former part of this continuation had been torn away to avoid wounding my feelings, perhaps the latter portion had been removed for fear of ministering too much to my self-conceit. At any rate, I would have given much to have seen it all, to have witnessed the gradual change, and watched the progress of her esteem and friendship for me, and whatever warmer feelings she might have, to have seen how much love there was in her regard, and how it had grown upon her in spite of her virtuous resolutions and strenuous exertions to— But no, I had no right to see it. All this was too sacred for any eyes but her own, and she had done well to keep it from me.
End of chapter 44. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Well, Halford, what do you think of all this? And while you read it, did you ever picture to yourself what my feelings would probably be during its perusal? Most likely not, but I am not going to descant upon them now. I will only make this acknowledgment, little honourable as it may be to human nature, and especially to myself, that the former half of the narrative was to me more painful than the latter. Not that I was at all insensible to Mrs. Huntingdon's wrongs or unmoved by her sufferings, but I must confess I felt a kind of selfish gratification in watching her husband's gradual decline in her good graces, and seeing how completely he extinguished all her affection at last. The effect of the whole, however, in spite of all my sympathy for her, and my fury against him, was to relieve my mind of an intolerable burden, and fill my heart with joy, as if some friend had roused me from a dreadful nightmare. It was now near 8 o'clock in the morning, for my candle had expired in the midst of my perusal, leaving me no alternative but to get another, at the expense of alarming the house, or to go to bed and wait the return of daylight. On my mother's account I chose the latter, but how willingly I sought my pillow, and how much sleep it brought me, I leave you to imagine. At the first appearance of dawn I rose, and brought the manuscript to the window, but it was impossible to read it yet. I devoted half an hour to dressing, and then returned to it again. Now, with a little difficulty, I could manage, and with intense and eager interest I devoured the remainder of its contents. When it was ended, and my transient regret at its abrupt conclusion was over, I opened the window and put out my head to catch the cooling breeze, and imbibe deep draughts of the pure morning air. A splendid morning it was. The half-frozen dew lay thick on the grass. The swallows were twittering round me, the rooks cawing, and cows lowing in the distance, and early frost and summer sunshine mingled their sweetness in the air. But I did not think of that. A confusion of countless thoughts and varied emotions crowded upon me, while I gazed abstractly on the lovely face of nature. Soon, however, this chaos of thoughts and passions cleared away, giving place to two distinct emotions. Joy unspeakable that my adored Helen was all I wished to think her, that through the noisome vapours of the world's aspersions, and my own fancied convictions, her character shone bright, and clear and stainless as that sun I could not bear to look on, and shame and deep remorse for my own conduct. Immediately after breakfast I hurried over to Wildfell Hall. Rachel had risen many degrees in my estimation since yesterday. I was ready to greet her quite as an old friend, but every kindly impulse was checked by the look of cold distrust she cast upon me on opening the door. The old virgin had constituted herself the guardian of her lady's honour, I suppose, and doubtless she saw in me another Mr. Hargrave, only the more dangerous in being more esteemed and trusted by her mistress.
"Missus can't see anyone to-day, sir. She's poorly,"
said she, in answer to my inquiry for Mrs. Graham. "But I must see her, Rachel," said I, placing my hand on the door to prevent its being shut against me.
"Indeed, sir, you can't,"
replied she, settling her countenance in still more iron frigidity than before. "Be so good as to announce me."
"It's no manner of use, Mr. Markham. She's poorly, I tell you."
Just in time to prevent me from committing the impropriety of taking the citadel by storm and pushing forward unannounced, an inner door opened, and little Arthur appeared with his frolicsome playfellow, the dog. He seized my hand between both his, and smilingly drew me forward.
"Mamma says you're to come in, Mr. Markham,"
said he.
"and I am to go out and play with Rover."
Rachel retired with a sigh. and I stepped into the parlour and shut the door. There, before the fireplace, stood the tall, graceful figure, wasted with many sorrows. I cast the manuscript on the table, and looked in her face. Anxious and pale, it was turned towards me. Her clear dark eyes were fixed on mine, with a gaze so intensely earnest that they bound me like a spell.
"Have you looked it over?"
she murmured. The spell was broken. "I've read it through," said I, advancing into the room, "and I want to know if you'll forgive me, if you can forgive me." She did not answer, but her eyes glistened, and a faint red mantled on her lip and cheek. As I approached, she abruptly turned away, and went to the window. It was not in anger, I was well assured, but only to conceal or control her emotion. I therefore ventured to follow and stand beside her there, but not to speak. She gave me her hand, without turning her head, and murmured in a voice she strove in vain to steady,
"Can you forgive me?"
It might be deemed a breach of trust, I thought, to convey that lily hand to my lips, so I only gently pressed it between my own, and smilingly replied, "I hardly can. You should have told me this before. It shows a want of confidence."
"Oh, no!"
cried she, eagerly interrupting me.
"It was not that. It was no want of confidence in you. But if I had told you anything of my history, I must have told you all, in order to excuse my conduct, and I might well shrink from such a disclosure, till necessity obliged me to make it. But you forgive me? I have done very, very wrong, I know. But, as usual, I have reaped the bitter fruits of my own error, and must reap them to the end."
Bitter indeed was the tone of anguish, repressed by resolute firmness, in which this was spoken. Now I raised her hand to my lips, and fervently kissed it again and again, for tears prevented any other reply. She suffered these wild caresses without resistance or resentment. Then suddenly turning from me, she paced twice or thrice through the room. I knew by the contraction of her brow, the tight compression of her lips, and wringing of her hands, that meantime a violent conflict between reason and passion was silently passing within. At length she paused before the empty fireplace, and, turning to me, said calmly, if that might be called calmness, which was so evidently the result of a violent effort,
"Now, Gilbert, you must leave me. Not this moment, but soon. And you must never come again."
"Never again, Helen, just when I love you more than ever."
"For that very reason, if it be so, we should not meet again. I thought this interview was necessary, at least I persuaded myself it was so, that we might severally ask and receive each other's pardon for the past. But there can be no excuse for another. I shall leave this place, as soon as I have means to seek another asylum, but our intercourse must end here."
"End here!" echoed I, and approaching the high carved chimney-piece, I leant my hand against its heavy mouldings, and dropped my forehead upon it in silent, sullen despondency.
"You must not come again,"
continued she. There was a slight tremor in her voice, but I thought her whole manner was provokingly composed, considering the dreadful sentence she pronounced.
"You must know why I tell you so,"
she resumed,
"and you must see that it is better to part at once. If it be hard to say adieu forever, you ought to help me."
She paused. I did not answer.
"Will you promise not to come? If you won't, and if you do come here again, you will drive me away before I know where to find another place of refuge, or how to seek it."
"Helen," said I, turning impatiently towards her, "I cannot discuss the matter of eternal separation calmly and dispassionately as you can do. It is no question of mere expedience with me. It is a question of life and death." She was silent. Her pale lips quivered, and her fingers trembled with agitation, as she nervously entwined them in the hair-chain to which was appended her small gold watch, the only thing of value she had permitted herself to keep. I had said an unjust and cruel thing, but I must needs follow it up with something worse. "But Helen," I began, in a soft, low tone, not daring to raise my eyes to her face, "that man is not your husband. In the sight of heaven he has forfeited all claim to—" She seized my arm with a grasp of startling energy.
"Gilbert, don't!"
she cried, in a tone that would have pierced a heart of adamant.
For God's sake, don't you attempt these arguments. No fiend could torture me like this.
I won't, said I, gently laying my hand on hers, almost as much alarmed at her vehemence as ashamed of my own misconduct.
Instead of acting like a true friend,
continued she, breaking from me, and throwing herself into the old armchair,
and helping me with all your might, or rather taking your own part in the struggle of right against passion, you leave all the burden to me, and not satisfied with that, you do your utmost to fight against me, when you know that.
She paused, and hid her face in her handkerchief. Forgive me, Helen, pleaded I. I will never utter another word on the subject, but may we not still meet as friends?
It will not do,
she replied, mournfully shaking her head, and then she raised her eyes to mine, with a mildly reproachful look that seemed to say,
You must know that as well as I.
Then what must we do? Cried I passionately, but immediately I added, in a quieter tone, I'll do whatever you desire. Only don't say that this meeting is to be our last.
And why not? Don't you know that every time we meet, the thoughts of the final parting will become more painful? Don't you feel that every interview makes us dearer to each other than the last?
The utterance of this last question was hurried and low, and the downcast eyes and burning blush too plainly showed that she at least had felt it. It was scarcely prudent to make such an admission, or to add, as she presently did,
I have power to bid you go now. Another time it might be different.
But I was not base enough to attempt to take advantage of her candour. But we may write, I timidly suggested. You will not deny me that consolation.
We can hear of each other through my brother.
Your brother? A pang of remorse and shame shot through me. She had not heard of the injury he had sustained at my hands, and I had not the courage to tell her. Your brother will not help us, I said. He would have all communion between us to be entirely at an end.
And he would be right, I suppose. As a friend of both, he would wish us both well, and every friend would tell us it was our interest, as well as our duty, to forget each other, though we might not see it ourselves. But don't be afraid, Gilbert,
she added, smiling sadly at my manifest discomposure.
There is little chance of my forgetting you. But I did not mean that Frederick should be the means of transmitting messages between us, only that each might know, through him, of the other's welfare. And more than this ought not to be. For you are young, Gilbert, and you ought to marry, and will sometime, though you may think it impossible now. And though I hardly can say I wish you to forget me, I know it is right that you should, both for your own happiness and that of your future wife, and therefore I must and will wish it,
she added resolutely. And you are young too, Helen, I boldly replied, and when that profligate scoundrel has run through his career, you will give your hand to me. I'll wait till then. But she would not leave me this support, independently of the moral evil of basing our hopes upon the death of another, who, if unfit for this world, was at least no less so for the next, and whose amelioration would thus become our bane, and his greatest transgression our greatest benefit. She maintained it to be madness. Many men of Mr. Huntingdon's habits had lived to a ripe though miserable old age.
And if I,
said she,
am young in years, I am old in sorrow. But even if trouble should fail to kill me before vice destroys him, think, if he reached but 50 years or so, would you wait 20 or 15 in vague uncertainty and suspense, through all the prime of youth and manhood, and marry at last a woman faded and worn as I shall be, without ever having seen me from this day to that? You would not,
she continued, interrupting my earnest protestations of unfailing constancy.
Or if you would, you should not. Trust me, Gilbert, in this matter I know better than you. You think me cold and stony-hearted, and you may, but—
I don't, Helen.
Well, never mind. You might if you would. But I have not spent my solitude in utter idleness, and I am not speaking now from the impulse of the moment, as you do. I have thought of all these matters again and again. I have argued these questions with myself, and pondered well our past, and present, and future career. And believe me, I have come to the right conclusion at last. Trust my words rather than your own feelings now, and in a few years you will see that I was right, though at present I hardly can see it myself."
she murmured with a sigh, as she rested her head on her hand.
"And don't argue against me any more. All you can say has already been said by my own heart, and refuted by my reason. It was hard enough to combat those suggestions as they were whispered within me. In your mouth they are 10 times worse, and if you knew how much they pain me, you would cease at once, I know. If you knew my present feelings, you would even try to relieve them at the expense of your own."
"I will go, in a minute, if that can relieve you, and never return," said I, with bitter emphasis. "But if we may never meet, and never hope to meet again, is it a crime to exchange our thoughts by letter? May not kindred spirits meet, and mingle in communion, whatever be the fate and circumstances of their earthly tenements?"
"They may! They may!"
cried she, with a momentary burst of glad enthusiasm.
"I thought of that too, Gilbert, but I feared to mention it, because I feared you would not understand my views upon the subject. I fear it even now. I fear any kind friend would tell us we are both deluding ourselves with the idea of keeping up a spiritual intercourse, without hope or prospect of anything further, without fostering vain regrets and hurtful aspirations, and feeding thoughts that should be sternly and pitilessly left to perish of inanition."
"Never mind our kind friends. If they can part our bodies, it is enough. In God's name, let them not sunder our souls," cried I, in terror lest she should deem it her duty to deny us this last remaining consolation.
"But no letters can pass between us here,"
said she,
"without giving fresh food for scandal. And when I departed, I had intended that my new abode should be unknown to you as to the rest of the world. Not that I should doubt your word if you promised not to visit me, but I thought you would be more tranquil in your own mind if you knew you could not do it, and likely to find less difficulty in abstracting yourself from me, if you could not picture my situation to your mind. But listen,"
said she, smilingly putting up her finger to check my impatient reply.
"In 6 months you shall hear from Frederick precisely where I am, and if you still retain your wish to write to me, and think you can maintain a correspondence all thought, all spirit, such as disembodied souls or unimpassioned friends at least might hold, write, and I will answer you."
6 months!
"Yes, to give your present ardour time to cool, and try the truth and constancy of your soul's love for mine. And now, enough has been said between us. Why can't we part at once?"
exclaimed she almost wildly, after a moment's pause, as she suddenly rose from her chair, with her hands resolutely clasped together. I thought it was my duty to go without delay, and I approached and half extended my hand as if to take leave. She grasped it in silence, but this thought of final separation was too intolerable. It seemed to squeeze the blood out of my heart, and my feet were glued to the floor. "And must we never meet again?" I murmured, in the anguish of my soul.
"We shall meet in heaven. Let us think of that,"
said she in a tone of desperate calmness, but her eyes glittered wildly, and her face was deadly pale. "But not as we are now," I could not help replying. "It gives me little consolation to think I shall next behold you as the disembodied spirit, or unaltered being, with a frame perfect and glorious, but not like this, and a heart perhaps entirely estranged from me."
"No, Gilbert, there is perfect love in heaven."
"So perfect, I suppose, that it soars above distinctions, and you will have no closer sympathy with me than with any one of the 10,000,000 angels and the innumerable multitude of happy spirits round us."
"Whatever I am, you will be the same, and therefore cannot possibly regret it. And whatever that change may be, we know it must be for the better."
"But if I am to be so changed that I shall cease to adore you with my whole heart and soul, and love you beyond every other creature, I shall not be myself, and though if ever I win heaven at all, I must, I know, be infinitely better and happier than I am now. My earthly nature cannot rejoice in the anticipation of such beatitude, from which itself and its chief joy must be excluded."
"Is your love all earthly, then?"
No, but I am supposing we shall have no more intimate communion with each other than with the rest.
If so, it will be because we love them more, and not each other less. Increase of love brings increase of happiness when it is mutual, and pure as that will be.
But can you, Helen, contemplate with delight this prospect of losing me in a sea of glory?
I own I cannot, but we know not that it will be so. And I do know that to regret the exchange of earthly pleasures for the joys of heaven is as if the grovelling caterpillar should lament that it must one day quit the nibbled leaf to soar aloft and flutter through the air, roving at will from flower to flower, sipping sweet honey from their cups, or basking in their sunny petals. If these little creatures knew how great a change awaited them, no doubt they would regret it. But would not all such sorrow be misplaced? And if that illustration will not move you, here is another. We are children now, we feel as children, and we understand as children. And when we are told that men and women do not play with toys, and that our companions will one day weary of the trivial sports and occupations that interest them and us so deeply now, we cannot help being saddened at the thoughts of such an alteration, because we cannot conceive that as we grow up, our own minds will become so enlarged and elevated that we ourselves shall then regard as trifling those objects and pursuits we now so fondly cherish, and that, though our companions will no longer join us in those childish pastimes, they will drink with us at other fountains of delight, and mingle their souls with ours in higher aims and nobler occupations beyond our present comprehension, but not less deeply relished or less truly good for that, while yet both we and they remain essentially the same individuals as before. But, Gilbert, can you really derive no consolation from the thought that we may meet together, where there is no more pain and sorrow, no more striving against sin, and struggling of the spirit against the flesh, where both will behold the same glorious truths, and drink exalted and supreme felicity from the same fountain of light and goodness, that being whom both will worship with the same intensity of holy ardour, and where pure and happy creatures both will love with the same divine affection? If you cannot, never write to me.
Helen, I can, if faith would never fail.
Now then,
exclaimed she,
while this hope is strong within us.
We will part, I cried. You shall not have the pain of another effort to dismiss me. I will go at once, but I did not put my request in words. She understood it instinctively, and this time she yielded too, or rather, there was nothing so deliberate as requesting or yielding in the matter. There was a sudden impulse that neither could resist. One moment I stood and looked into her face, the next I held her to my heart, and we seemed to grow together in a close embrace from which no physical or mental force could rend us. A whispered,
God bless you,
and
go, go,
was all she said. But while she spoke, she held me so fast that without violence I could not have obeyed her. At length, however, by some heroic effort, we tore ourselves apart, and I rushed from the house. I have a confused remembrance of seeing little Arthur running up the garden walk to meet me, and of bolting over the wall to avoid him, and subsequently running down the steep fields, clearing the stone fences and hedges as they came in my way, till I got completely out of sight of the old hall, and down to the bottom of the hill, and then of long hours spent in bitter tears and lamentations, and melancholy musings in the lonely valley, with the eternal music in my ears, of the west wind rushing through the overshadowing trees, and the brook babbling and gurgling along its stony bed, my eyes for the most part vacantly fixed on the deep checkered shades, restlessly playing over the bright sunny grass at my feet, where now and then a withered leaf or two would come dancing to share the revelry. But my heart was away up the hill, in that dark room, where she was weeping desolate and alone, she whom I was not to comfort, not to see again, till years or suffering had overcome us both, and torn our spirits from their perishing abodes of clay. There was little business done that day, you may be sure. The farm was abandoned to the labourers, and the labourers were left to their own devices. But one duty must be attended to. I had not forgotten my assault upon Frederick Lawrence, and I must see him to apologize for the unhappy deed. I would fain have put it off till the-morrow. But what if he should denounce me to his sister in the meantime? No, no! I must ask his pardon to-day, and entreat him to be lenient in his accusation, if the revelation must be made. I deferred it, however, till the evening, when my spirits were more composed, and when, O wonderful perversity of human nature, some faint germs of indefinite hopes were beginning to rise in my mind. Not that I intended to cherish them, after all that had been said on the subject, but there they must lie for a while, uncrushed though not encouraged, till I had learnt to live without them. Arrived at Woodford, the young squire's abode, I found no little difficulty in obtaining admission to his presence. The servant that opened the door told me his master was very ill, and seemed to think it doubtful whether he would be able to see me. I was not going to be balked, however. I waited calmly in the hall to be announced, but inwardly determined to take no denial. The message was such as I expected, a polite intimation that Mr. Lawrence could see no one. He was feverish, and must not be disturbed. I shall not disturb him long, said I, but I must see him for a moment. It is on business of importance that I wish to speak to him.
I'll tell him, sir,
said the man, and I advanced further into the hall, and followed him nearly to the door of the apartment, where his master was, for it seemed he was not in bed. The answer returned was that Mr. Lawrence hoped I would be so good as to leave a message or a note with the servant, as he could attend to no business at present. He may as well see me as you, said I, and, stepping past the astonished footman, I boldly rapped at the door, entered and closed it behind me. The room was spacious and handsomely furnished, very comfortably, too, for a bachelor. A clear red fire was burning in the polished grate. A superannuated greyhound, given up to idleness and good living, lay basking before it on the thick, soft rug, on one corner of which, beside the sofa, sat a smart young springer, looking wistfully up in its master's face, perhaps asking permission to share his couch, or it might be only soliciting a caress from his hand or a kind word from his lips. The invalid himself looked very interesting, as he lay reclining there, in his elegant dressing-gown, with a silk handkerchief bound across his temples. His usually pale face was flushed and feverish. His eyes were half closed, until he became sensible of my presence, and then he opened them wide enough. One hand was thrown listlessly over the back of the sofa, and held a small volume, with which apparently he had been vainly attempting to beguile the weary hours. He dropped it, however, in a start of indignant surprise, as I advanced into the room, and stood before him on the rug. He raised himself on his pillows, and gazed upon me with equal degrees of nervous horror, anger, and amazement depicted on his countenance.
Mr. Markham, I scarcely expected this,
he said, and the blood left his cheek as he spoke. I know you didn't, answered I, but be quiet a minute, and I'll tell you what I came for. Unthinkingly I advanced a step or two nearer. He winced at my approach, with an expression of aversion and instinctive physical fear, anything but conciliatory to my feelings. I stepped back, however.
Make your story a short one,
said he, putting his hand on the small silver bell that stood on the table beside him.
Or I shall be obliged to call for assistance. I am in no state to bear your brutalities now, or your presence either.
And in truth the moisture started from his pores, and stood on his pale forehead like dew. Such a reception was hardly calculated to diminish the difficulties of my unenviable task. It must be performed, however, in some fashion, and so I plunged into it at once, and floundered through it as I could. The truth is, Lawrence, said I have not acted quite correctly towards you of late, especially on this last occasion, and I am come in short, to express my regret for what has been done, and to beg your pardon. If you don't choose to grant it, I added hastily, not liking the aspect of his face. "It's no matter, only I've done my duty, that's all."
"It's easily done,"
replied he, with a faint smile bordering on a sneer.
"To abuse your friend and knock him on the head without any assignable cause, and then tell him the deed was not quite correct, but it's no matter whether he pardons it or not."
"I forgot to tell you that it was in consequence of a mistake," muttered I. "I should have made a very handsome apology, but you provoked me so confoundedly with your— well, I suppose it's my fault. The fact is, I didn't know that you were Mrs. Graham's brother, and I saw and heard some things respecting your conduct towards her, which were calculated to awaken unpleasant suspicions, that, allow me to say, a little candour and confidence on your part might have removed, and at last I chanced to overhear a part of a conversation between you and her that made me think I had a right to hate you."
"And how came you to know that I was her brother?"
asked he, in some anxiety. "She told me herself. She told me all. She knew I might be trusted. But you needn't disturb yourself about that, Mr. Lawrence, for I've seen the last of her."
"The last? Is she gone, then?"
"No, but she has bid adieu to me, and I have promised never to go near that house again while she inhabits it." I could have groaned aloud at the bitter thoughts awakened by this turn in the discourse, but I only clenched my hands and stamped my foot upon the rug. My companion, however, was evidently relieved.
"You have done right,"
he said, in a tone of unqualified approbation, while his face brightened into almost a sunny expression.
"And as for the mistake, I am sorry for both our sakes that it should have occurred. Perhaps you can forgive my want of candour, and remember, as some partial mitigation of the offence, how little encouragement to friendly confidence you have given me of late."
Yes, yes, I remember it all. Nobody can blame me more than I blame myself in my own heart. At any rate, nobody can regret more sincerely than I do the result of my brutality, as you rightly term it.
"Never mind that,"
said he, faintly smiling.
"Let us forget all unpleasant words on both sides, as well as deeds, and consign to oblivion everything that we have cause to regret. Have you any objection to take my hand, or you'd rather not?"
It trembled through weakness as he held it out, and dropped before I had time to catch it and give it a hearty squeeze, which he had not the strength to return. "How dry and burning your hand is, Lawrence," said I. "You are really ill, and I have made you worse by all this talk."
"Oh, it is nothing, only a cold got by the rain."
"My doing, too."
"Never mind that. But tell me, did you mention this affair to my sister?"
"To confess the truth, I had not the courage to do so. But when you tell her, will you just say that I deeply regret it, and—"
"Oh, never fear. I shall say nothing against you, as long as you keep your good resolution of remaining aloof from her. She has not heard of my illness, then, that you are aware of?"
"I think not."
"I'm glad of that, for I've been all this time tormenting myself with the fear that somebody would tell her I was dying, or desperately ill, and she would be either distressing herself on account of her inability to hear from me or do me any good, or perhaps committing the madness of coming to see me. I must contrive to let her know something about it, if I can,"
continued he, reflectively.
"or she will be hearing some such story. Many would be glad to tell her such news just to see how she would take it, and then she might expose herself to fresh scandal."
"I wish I had told her," said I. "If it were not for my promise, I would tell her now."
"By no means. I am not dreaming of that. But if I were to write a short note, now not mentioning you, Markham, but just giving a slight account of my illness by way of excuse for my not coming to see her, and to put her on her guard against any exaggerated report she may hear, and address it in a disguised hand, would you do me the favor to slip it into the post office as you pass? For I dare not trust any of the servants in such a case."
Most willingly I consented, and immediately brought him his desk. There was little need to disguise his hand, for the poor fellow seemed to have considerable difficulty in writing at all, so as to be legible. When the note was done, I thought it time to retire, and took leave, after asking if there was anything in the world I could do for him, little or great, in the way of alleviating his sufferings and repairing the injury I had done.
No,
said he.
You have already done much towards it. You have done more for me than the most skilful physician could do, for you have relieved my mind of two great burdens, anxiety on my sister's account, and deep regret upon your own. For I do believe these two sources of torment had more effect in working me up into the fever than anything else, and I am persuaded I shall soon recover now. There is one more thing you can do for me, and that is, come and see me now and then, for you see I am very lonely here, and I promise your entrance shall not be disputed again.
I engaged to do so, and departed with a cordial pressure of the hand. I posted the letter on my way home, most manfully resisting the temptation of dropping in a word from myself at the same time.
End of chapter 45.